are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Bitch, I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck.
What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian. And we are joined by Leigh Phillips. Leigh is a journalist, a science writer, and the author of two books of which I'm an enormous fan. One is called Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse Porn Addicts, A Defense of Growth, Progress, Industry, and Stuff. And The People's Republic of Walmart, which I just found an incredibly affecting book. Leigh, sorry, that's enough about you. How's it going? Hi.
Hi, great. Great to be here. I should say that People's Republic of Walmart is co-authored with Michał Rosworski.
Yes.
So
that's very, sorry, very
if
gracious.
If I don't say that, he'll,
Yeah, so, we're so happy you're here. We're really excited to, you're going to help us science the shit out of the left, I think, is,
right.
to coin a phrase. But we're really curious about sort of you. I mean, you how did you reach your politics? And you've clearly taken,
Wow.
Yeah, you've taken a very sort of, you're a scientific person. And you've reached a sort of socialism. What took you on that path?
Actually, maybe it's probably the other way around, in the sense that I guess it's a very long story, but basically I was writing a lot as a science journalist in Brussels after I got out of university. And I was writing a lot, not exclusively, but a lot about climate change and energy policy. And, I was doing a lot of, I was a lefty, at university. I was, involved in all sorts of crazy radical, stuff like trying to reduce tuition fees, and stuff like that.
Wild.
And yeah, crazy idea, that no country in the world could possibly reduce or even eliminate their tuition fees. I don't know, most of Europe. Anyway, and so that was just part of that was who I was. But my day job was just as a regular science writer, science journalist. But because I was, progressive, socialist, a lot of the arguments I found myself making at the time in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, was around climate change, and on the sort of the right, the conservatives who would be denying the reality of anthropogenic global warming. And so you're leaning a lot on the scientific literature to make your arguments against these figures. And then after a while, I began to notice turn around, like, oh wait, my team is also playing fast and loose with the science, particularly around nuclear energy and the sort of the standard shibboleths on the left about its lack of safety, which is not true, and also specifically around the safety of genetic engineering and genetically modified organisms within agriculture. And I was just getting increasingly frustrated that there would be progressive activists who would rightly be saying 97% of scientists accept the reality of anthropogenic global warming. But then when it came to the safety of nuclear, there's a similar level of scientific consensus, and there's absolutely a similar level of scientific consensus on the safety of GMOs. And so I started just picking away at that sort of stuff, writing an article here, an article there, dropping stuff into my articles because I did both just sort of straightforward journalism for mainstream publications and also sort of stuff for left-wing publications on the side that pays, tons of money. Anyway, and that sort of, my initial thoughts were like, if I'm the one who's saying this, then everybody's gonna like agree, because they're like, well, he's a lefty. He's not a shill for Monsanto. So maybe I need to reconsider my ideas, because I trust this guy. But that wasn't really what happened. There's a lot of discussion at the moment. You guys are really great on this front in terms of this sort of internecine battles on the left between so-called class reductionist and sort of identitarian or identity politics.
So which side are you on?
I could joke and say I'm class reductionist, but that would be what other people would dismiss me as.
Yes.
The reality is I would say that I just think that identity, it's not that I don't care about liberation from oppression, whether we're talking about race, gender, sexuality, whatever. It's that I don't think that identity politics is a very good way of achieving that liberation, that it's a class collaborationist pathway to liberation, and that always fails. Never mind. And basically what I was going to say on that front was that, so there's a lot of focus at the moment on the left on that sort of discourse and the problems of that discourse. And I'm very happy to see that conversation is finally happening. A similar thing happened with respect to climate and energy and the environment more generally, but also a few other issues not related to the environment, certainly around alternative medicine and vaccines. It's not exclusively on the left, but certainly there is a unhealthy chunk of the left that does not trust conventional medicine and is looking to other ways of knowing. That stuff has a lot of fallout from postmodernism within the academy. I know postmodernism is a term that's a little bit loose and ill-defined, but nevertheless, we all know what we mean when I use that term. Anyway, basically those sorts of anti-realist or epistemic anti-realist conceptions that now sort of escape the academy, and they're abroad in society, and they have, I would say, nothing to do with socialism, certainly nothing to do with Marxism, and those need to be combated as well.
So in your book, Austerity Ecology, you talk a lot about this like degrowth and Malthusian left, which is kind of ironic since the left often tells themselves as the party of science. Like we believe in science, like a common trope on those like lawn silent, like signs of like Black Lives Matter and all these things. But you point out they don't actually believe in science in many regards, whether it's nuclear power or vaccines. And with the most recent example being like Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans documentary, which I saw you wrote an article about. Why does the left keep reiterating these talking points? And like, is actually getting better, or do you think it's getting worse still? Like,
we'll see. I think that there are a lot of writers within Jacobin and in some European publications that are beginning to sort of tackle some of this stuff. Not completely. I mean, Jacobin's a very, very broad church, but more and more people are more critical, let's say, and rather than just assuming the shibboleths of the green left or the left in general. But yeah, I guess some of the stuff around degrowth really just comes from, again, a very personal experience. I mean, I come from a working class family. I mean, my mom and dad are doing okay at the moment, but when I went to university, I was the first one in my family to go straight to university and graduate. My mom went when I was in high school, but this is, there's no doctors, no lawyers in my family, no architects, nothing like that. Not even, and when I went to university, it was very difficult in terms of living expenses, tuition fees, and so on and so forth. And this was around sort of the anti-globalization movement and the battle in Seattle and that sort of stuff. Now you know how old I am. I say that. But there was something called Buy Nothing Day. And a lot of anarchists, not just anarchists, just activists in general, would organize on Black Friday after American Thanksgiving. And I'm Canadian, so we have Canadian Thanksgiving at a different time. And the idea was that this day you just refuse to consume anything. And because of my family situation, and I wanted some, like, finally to be able to buy more things days, really. And I just felt it was so condescending and just completely unconnected to the reality of the working class. And I think if we're looking at sort of explanations as to why this happens, not just with respect to science and technology and issues around environmentalism and versus degrowth, but also identity politics and postmodernism, is that we're materialists. We have to have some sort of material economic explanation for this phenomenon. And I would argue that in the 1970s, there was a world historic defeat of the working class across the Western world by the forces of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and so on and so forth. And they literally broke the power of the trade unions. And in that defeat, amidst that defeat, the left, or the sort of what today we might call the professional managerial class, retreated from being based in the trade unions and based in the class itself into the academy, into non-governmental organizations, and into the media. And, I'm in the media. I'm not like, there's no condemnation of these people. There's nothing wrong with being the professional class. The problem is when the entirety of the left, or the bulk of the left, is based in that much higher sort of class location, with higher levels of education, often higher levels of income. Yes, as Marxists, we would say that the register of the class is your relationship to the means of production, not necessarily the amount of income that you earn. Nevertheless, that does have some influence. And the reason why I have this shaggy dog story about the 1970s is that we can critique identity politics, or we can critique eco-austerity, or we can critique postmodernism. That's all great, but we need a theory that explains why these things emerge. And I think that's what happened, basically. It's the breaking of the connection between the left and the working class, and that ultimately the only resolution to all of these is for the working class to move for itself again, and for the professional classes to play their historic role within that coalition, which is, sure, we may have had a little bit more education. There are certainly roles that we can play along those lines, but fundamentally we are disciplined by the social weight of the mass of the working class, where they're able to say, when a crazy idea from some middle class anarchist at university says, it's time for us to buy nothing today, the rest of the class says, excuse me, we've had 4 fucking decades of nothing but wage stagnation. 60% of Americans live month to month. What on earth are you fucking talking about? We need to consume less. That's what I mean by sort of like the disciplining of the class when these crazy ideas pop up.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I felt extremely seen by the book because I used to be part of like into the Green Party politics and a deep ecology anarchists and all of that stuff. And it was actually, I think you made the point in your book, the libertarians were the few that actually at least talk about progress and kind of refute some of these anti-science claims. That's something for me. I was a libertarian throughout college and then I left, luckily. But you mentioned a really important part of this whole history of like anti-growth and a lot of these organizations being tied to like the far right, which I didn't even know about, like the Rewilding Institute or other groups like that. Yeah. Can you explain that more? And like, how did that right-wing ideology intercept the left?
Sure. So we should be just very upfront and clear. when we talk about eco-fascism and the role of environmentalism on the far right, at no point are we saying that everybody who's an environmentalist, everybody who's concerned about climate change, biodiversity loss, et cetera, are fascists. That would be absurd. I mean, this is where I come from as well. You know, I was in Earth First. I had, you know, one of my first jobs was a door knocker for Greenpeace. You know, like it just, there's no possible way that I could make that claim.
Although that tweet would do numbers. If you were to tweet that claim, it would definitely do well. So, you know,
oh, yeah.
On a slow day, maybe. Sorry, you were saying.
No, it's all good. At the same time, we have to recognize that there is a sort of working class environmentalism from, you know, there's a lot of writing about the working class environmentalism of trade unions and communities fighting against air pollution and water pollution from the 50s through the 60s and 70s. But this goes as far back as the mines and mills of the 19th and 18th centuries. That's always been there. At the same time, there was also a very, very sort of more elite environmentalism, which working class organizations were very, very critical of historically. We said, this has nothing to do with us. Your preservationism basically is about preventing us from accessing housing. It's preventing us from accessing parks. There's a whole aspect of indigenous sort of colonization of indigenous lands that's wrapped up within a lot of early 20th century conservation efforts. And as late as the 1970s, you can read articles in, say, the New Left Review or other left-wing publications that remain very critical of the Malthusianism and sort of class politics of this one kind of environmentalism. And I would argue that, again, because of that historic defeat of the working class and the retreat of the left into the academy, that is the reason why that sort of second set of environmental ideas, a very elite Malthusian set of environmental ideas, seeped into the left. It's a cuckoo's egg in the nest of the left.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and is a good segue into the other big topic we wanted to kind of ask you about. You have been a vocal advocate of nuclear power, and have made the case in the book and elsewhere that really it should be a cause that the left should take up in some sense, or that this should be not something we cede. Sam and I think, share this view. I think I would never have been able to formulate the case as well as you did prior to reading your book. But you did a debate, for example, with Christian Parenti not so long ago, hosted by Jacobin, I believe, and on the subject of nuclear power. And it was sort of interesting that, that was a... well, maybe, sorry, just for the listeners, I could sort of give a quick summary to say, I think you were giving a, I think an impassioned case about both what it means to have progress and then kind of delivering some facts and figures, which maybe could be broadly summarized as nuclear power, like most of what you understand about nuclear power is wrong, and nuclear safety is wrong. Christian Parenti, oddly enough, was working up to some sort of market logic about the cost of it and things like that, which was bizarre. Would love to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe, just like what is it that people are missing about nuclear power these days?
All right, so the elevator pitch for nuclear, and let me start by saying that I was not always supporter of nuclear. I was never like super anti, because I grew up between two nuclear power plants, Pickering in Ontario and Darlington in Ontario. And, in my Boy Scouts troop, we went and had a visit there. And so I was never really worried about meltdown or anything like that, or radiation. I was concerned about nuclear waste. And so I just sort of, even though it wasn't like a sort of main line of my set of ideas, I just sort of accepted it as, that's on the left. That's something that I agree with. And as a result of doing all this work on climate change and energy policy, I increasingly, a lot of stuff that I was doing was working around, was criticizing sort of false market solutions to climate change. And I kind of recognized that, nuclear power is this very strange sort of situation where actually it ticks all the boxes that you want for clean energy. It's super low emissions. It's much lower than wind and solar, although wind and solar are great as well, and they're very low, certainly compared to gas and coal and oil. But distinct from wind and solar, it's firm. That's a energy systems term. Basically means it's reliable. You can use it anytime that you want, 24/7. You don't have to wait for the sun to shine or the wind to blow for you to be able to use this. And yes, we should be putting a lot more research into batteries and other forms of energy storage, and that's great. But realistically, there's a couple of different points here, but we need to be moving right now. We can't wait another 10 years or 20 years for some sort of fantastical battery tech to come along to solve that problem. Also, quite frankly, the cheapest, cleanest form of energy storage is actually really simple. It's just putting water, behind a dam, really. And that's basically what hydroelectric power is, or pump storage hydro. And that takes up an enormous amount of land compared to nuclear. So you're now beginning to have a very significant impact on biodiversity loss. And what we don't want to be doing is that as we solve the climate crisis, that we suddenly now may exacerbate the biodiversity loss crisis. And so all of the, nuclear waste. So it turns out that nuclear waste is not the issue that we thought it was. France reprocesses. Most of it's uranium. Most waste is spent fuel. 96% of that is recyclable. And the only reason that we don't recycle that spent fuel in North America is because we've just got a huge reserves of it in northern Saskatchewan. It is simply cheaper. It's just pennies on the dollar, but it is simply cheaper to just dig it out of the ground than to reprocess it. The reason France doesn't do this is because France doesn't have a domestic source of uranium. We could do this tomorrow with a simple change to regulations. So there's that. And then at the end of that reprocessing, so you've got about 4% waste left over. The radioactivity from that is significantly reduced to the point that you could store it for 300 years and it would basically be fine. Even before those 300 years up, the radioactivity is radically reduced. And the other thing that people forget is that there's a range of other different sources of radiation in the world that we live with and we're perfectly happy with, that pose a much greater threat than nuclear waste that's stored.
Yeah. So one of the objections I think I've heard is a little bit about uranium extraction specifically in terms of
right. Yeah.
What I did not realize, but in the course of doing research for this interview, I did find out. That uranium is actually an incredibly common element in the Earth's crust. I mean, it is above things like tin and bismuth, gold, silver, all these things we kind of use in our daily lives. So we're not really going to run out of it sort of realistically. We could transition all of Earth's power to that and probably have hundreds or thousands of years of sustained growth and power.
Absolutely. And that's before we think about extracting uranium from seawater. And it's complicated going into the chemistry of this, but basically because it's a matter of exchange with the Earth's crust, for all intents and purposes, it now becomes renewable. The minute that you take uranium out of out of seawater, the same amount is absorbed back into the ocean. So it is, for as long as we'll have oceans on the Earth, we're never going to run out of uranium.
And so, the then perhaps the claim or the danger is around extractive industries themselves. I mean, it is still
Right.
a mining operation. There's clearly some kind of awful history, specifically of uranium mining on indigenous lands.
100%. Yeah.
But as you mentioned, there is a giant Canadian source of it. The ethics and operation, which I don't quite understand. But do you think it's just an inherent problem with all extractive industries, or is there ways we can make it better or worse?
So this is another example of how the left is being separated from the working class. If you go into any working class community in Canada, the United States, which has worse levels of regulatory environmental protection, health and safety standards, and much lower levels of union density than in Canada, those mining communities would not say, shut down the mines. What they want is a clean environment and strong health and safety conditions, good wages. And here's the reality that in Canada, Canada's not perfect by any stretch, but as a result of over 100 years of trade union struggle, indigenous struggle, and latterly, like 50, 60 years of environmental struggle, the environmental standards, remediation, health and safety standards within those mines is world class. The radical reduction in health and safety risk. And these are good union jobs, family supporting union jobs. It is absolutely true. You've hit the nail on the head that historically, because of Canadian colonialism, during the Manhattan Project, the first sort of miners to dig up uranium to support that project were Dene in northern Canada, and they were treated appallingly. They were the last to receive any sort of health and safety equipment to the level that there was health and safety equipment at that time because of blatant racism. That doesn't happen today. That doesn't mean it's a golden dawn of kumbaya happiness between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada today. Far from it. But the reality is that in northern Saskatchewan, which is majority Indigenous, uranium mining is the largest single industrial employer of First Nations in the country, and where in much of the country there are unemployment rates in the 70s, 80s, 90s on reserves, terrible homelessness crisis amongst Indigenous people in the cities. In northern Saskatchewan, these are family supporting union jobs. So First Nations in that region, rather than being campaigning against the uranium mining, they issue in recent last couple of years, they put out a number of statements calling on the federal government to fight for more nuclear power, because they're worried about loss of jobs as a result of the closures of nuclear power plants in the United States. Tangentially, by the way, almost all of which are when nuclear power plants are shut down, they're not replaced. They tend not to be replaced by wind and solar, but by natural gas.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the book also how countries like France had rapid de-escalations in carbon emissions once they instituted mass nuclear power. But after Fukushima, it seemed so many of the European powers like Switzerland and Germany are kind of abandoning the practice. Like, what's going on there? And are they just not paying attention to the science of decreasing carbon emissions, or is it like something else going on?
There's a number of different issues there. It depends on which country you're talking about. Domestically, there has been, certainly even in the last year, even the last few months, something of a renaissance with respect to nuclear, both conventional and advanced nuclear. And advanced nuclear has much greater safety standards. It's passive safety, so it literally can't melt down. Having said that, even conventional, it is the safest energy source in the world. The number of deaths per terawatt hour, the lowest of any energy source. Sorry, back to the question of European Union. There's some strange things going on that are specific to the European Union. Sweden is very committed to nuclear power. Finland is very committed to nuclear power. France historically was the most committed to nuclear power of all countries in the world. They had the fastest decarbonization of their electricity grid of any country in the world, any region in the world, as a result of their build out of nuclear power in the 70s and 80s. But France is a very strange place, and I say this with deep love and affection, especially living right next door in Belgium for so many years. I have to say, I read the French press on a regular basis, and if we think that the Green Left is crazy and nonsensical in North America, it is off the chain bananas in France. It utterly dominates the discourse there. So there's that. The second thing contributing to this issue is just the very structure of the European Union. Going down a rabbit hole of complexity around how the European problems with the European Union, but basically. The European Union itself is not democratically elected. The European Commission, which initiates legislation, is unelected. European Council, the people on the European Council are elected as heads of state or government or ministers, but the Council is effectively a legislative chamber and there's no elections to it. European Parliament is elected, but it has no powers. Okay. As a result of that, green NGOs engage in regulatory capture of European Commission sort of decision-making very easily, in the same way that corporations very easily capture regulatory decision-making. And this is really crucial to understand, because a lot of times on the left, we talk about, and rightfully so, corporate capture of decision-making. It's very true in the European Union. Because of the Europeans' lack of democracy, that actually has that allows for so-called white hat regulatory capture as well.
So, I mean, I feel like maybe what sometimes gets lost is like why this matters, right? Because people think of electricity, right? Power is electricity. It comes out of a wall switch, whatever, but there's still everything else running around. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, just the further future in terms of as we think about growth, human progress, enrichment of lives,
right.
Arability of land, or this is all sort of an energy question, right? I mean, the bold socialist future we want to build needs energy, plentiful, cheap.
100%. Energy is, to take the physics definition, is the ability to do work. So immediately as socialists, we can begin to say okay, so energy effectively is wealth, because work is performed by people. If work is more easily done with more energy, cheaper, more easily accessible energy, we can get more work done. We can be wealthier people as a society. Historically, Marxists and other socialists argued that that the whole purpose of our project was to, at least in the near term, to get as much of the value that we create as workers to ourselves, and a reduction in its exploitation. It's taking that, not use the Marxist jargon, surplus value that is exploited from workers, but ultimately to take over the machine and run it for ourselves. And the reason we talked about that was that in the service of profit in the market, the creation of any commodity is captured by that interest alone. If there is something that is useful to produce, but it isn't profitable, markets won't produce it. A great example of that at the moment is the reluctance over the last 25, 30 years of major pharmaceutical companies to be producing new classes of antibiotic. On the other side of the spectrum, if there is something profitable but harmful to us, then that commodity will continue to be produced. And of course, the classic example at the moment is fossil fuels. So but certainly in the first case, what we were arguing for there is that capitalism doesn't produce enough. That there's the category, the set of all things that are potentially useful is much larger the set of all things that is profitable. So historically, Marx has always said that capitalism unnecessarily fetters production. So that's more jargon there, but basically it limits what could be made. Our argument was always, we want more, that socialism would deliver so much more. So it is a very, very strange thing indeed to be hearing people saying that we need to have less. On the sort of the progress front on human, not just human well-being, but steady advance. They make a distinction between needs and wants. Well, again, in the late 19th century, there's a great phrase, often from some early feminist socialists. We want bread, but we want roses too. And then in the dark days of the Soviet Union, one of the most coherent internal critiques of the Soviet Union was there were no jeans, there was no pineapples, there was no rock and roll records. No, we want consumer items as well. And this false division between needs and wants. Yes, obviously, things like healthcare and education are the priority. Nevertheless, we want a nice life too. And consistently, what we see from these people, these eco-Austerians, is, they like nice things too. But funnily enough, they never seem to like Barbie dolls or flat screen TVs or Xboxes. They sneer at them. All these things that the vast majority of working people love, but they love what they love, and they have no problem with these sort of issues. Would be like some hand carved children's doll Pinocchio or whatever that they can get from some shishi artisanal workshop. And it is, I would say, that is the bulk of this is nothing but a middle class based sneering at the desires of working class people.
Yeah, another really important part of the book, what I think is the most important takeaway I had, was this degrowth ideology is calling for austerity. I mean, you point out to the Greens, who do have power in Europe, which we don't have in the US. They've excessively called for like liberalization of like the energy economy because it's so certain things. Could you kind of go more into detail of like how degrowth is austerity, and like why are these green parties, who many in the US we consider like eco-socialists or whatever, are calling for like neoliberal policies?
It's so weird to see those words coming out of so-called socialists' mouths. Again, after 40 years of economic austerity, stagnating wages, as a result of neoliberalism, working class people desperately want more. And let me put it another way. Do you remember the Gilets jaunes protests in France?
Yes,
the yellow vest protests, right? They had this great phrase, and it was a protest around basically a carbon tax, really, an environmentally, a climate-oriented tax on gasoline, and these were people who were from the smaller towns or villages. They didn't have access to public transport because of, again, 40 years of cutting of social services. A lot of buses don't go to these areas. Trains stop running to these areas. As more and more of the transport system is being privatized, there's no longer any profit-making interest in delivering those services to those people. They have no choice but to drive a car. And here was this it's been many places have been deindustrialized. There are very few jobs. Young people are emigrating out of those regions. In many places there are ghost towns, and they were just furious. And they said their famous phrase was, there are people who think about the end of the planet, end of the world. Meanwhile, we think about the end of the month. And so this is what I mean by eco-austerity or eco-Thatcherism. The degrowth theorists argue that we all in the West, which means all working class people, need to consume less, and that people in the developing world they do say that people in the developing world should be able to consume more. But you have to come from a certain level of privilege in the West to be able to make those arguments. If you are assuming that we all in the West consume too much, well, you can't have come from a community that has been suffering for 40 years economically. that's been deindustrialized. Yeah, I guess that's sort of the main thing I wanted to say there.
Well, so merely slaying the dragons of sort of left techno-pessimism is not your only project. In fact, that's going back a little bit for you, isn't it? I mean, because after that, as we mentioned in your intro, you co-authored another book called The People's Republic of Walmart, which I've just got to say had a profound impact on me. The listeners know this. You probably don't know this about me. I'm a mathematician by training.
Oh, awesome!
Yeah, and so the thesis of the book, if you don't mind me attempting a précis, is that these giant companies like Walmart, Amazon, et cetera, I mean, have built these incredible central planning mechanisms.
Yeah.
And that this is actually sort of evidence of the value of central planning. One of the most just sublime passages in the book is the description of it was Sears, right? That
yes.
decided to run internal markets. And I've got to say, I was just roaring out with laughter as you were describing the sort of what the stores were starting to look like and the weird internal market they were trying to run between like the hardware, the whiteware department and the clothing department or whatever. So would be curious, for one, how do you get to the book? Who, maybe you could say who your co-author is, given I accidentally elided him from your intro, and then a little bit about his background as well, and then kind of just curious, where have we gone from when you wrote the book?
All right, that's a pretty good précis. Basically, yeah, the idea is that it's a book about, it's a history of the economic calculation debate, also known as the socialist calculation debate, which was a debate mainly in the 20s and 30s, but has gone through to the 2010s as well, over the feasibility of economic planning. And the argument, roughly, there's many aspects to it, but very roughly, the argument from conservative economists has been that there are simply too many variables in a system of production for any human planners to be able to track all of those variables. Later on, the argument then becomes there are simply too many variables for even any computer to be able to track. That these, as a mathematician, you'll be familiar that there's uncountable infinities there, and it is probably the strongest argument that has ever been mounted against the feasibility of socialism. It's excellent, and socialists need to take the critiques very, very seriously. The argument that all that we need to do is just to take power and then we'll sort everything out day 2 after the revolution. It's just a matter of willpower is dead wrong. Allocation of goods and services, if it's not going to be performed by the market, is a very, very hard task. In Canada, where I live, we have a public healthcare system. And so there's no money that exchanges, on the fringes of stuff, like dentistry and stuff, which is terrible, whatever. But for the most part, I just rock up to a clinic or hospital with my health card, and I get my business done, and then that's it. And so internally within that system, there is a vast amount of planning that goes on. Healthcare is one of the most complex sectors in society. The number of variables that the planners within that system have to grapple with are enormous or colossal. And yet the outcomes are vastly superior, whatever metric you want to take in terms of health outcomes, vastly superior to the health outcomes in the United States with its primarily free market healthcare system. So we've got this weird sort of situation where the conservative economists within the economic calculation debate said mathematically it should not be possible for us to do this planning. And yet in the real world, what we see is, in the case of public healthcare, actually much superior outcomes than the market allocation. And then also corporations like Walmart and Amazon, particularly Walmart. Like Walmart is now roughly, like it's not exactly the same size, but it's on the same scale as the size of the Soviet Union at the height of its economic powers, let's say in the 1970s, before it sort of headed into some severe decline. So with many more variables, many millions more variables within its system than the few 100,000 variables in the Soviet system. So we've got this strange situation where communism doesn't work in theory, but it seems to work in practice, or at least economic planning does. And so the idea behind our book is not to make a sort of hard and fast argument that planning the entirety of the global economy is, we've proven that it works. No, the argument is simply that planning at great scale is feasible. I still, as a socialist, I have a gut instinct that global planning of pretty much everything is probably feasible. But if you're a socialist, if you're a social democrat, if you're a market socialist, if you are just a liberal, even if you're like an Eisenhower Republican that still has some sort of belief in the power of the public sector to do good in the world, this book is for you. You should be able to read this, and it gives you an argument as to why it's fine for there to be public sector endeavors.
Yeah, I mean, it really, I mean, is a, I've got to give you the compliment to say, I mean, it goes into quite some detail, but is incredibly sort of readable to a lay audience. I mean, it's not designed to be a technical work. I do have an about 1,000-page sort of like handbook of socialist planning questions or something like somewhere, and it's not that at all. But I mean, it's sort of fascinating thinking about these allocation challenges. Given that we've just gone through an unprecedented pandemic, and you alluded to antibiotics, for example, as well. I mean, there were breadlines in the heart of the capitalist machine. San Francisco has still has breadlines. I remember very distinctly yeast ran out and flour, right, in all the supermarkets because everyone was at home, decided to bake bread. Then our wonderfully sort of efficient over-allocation capitalist machine has stacked every supermarket with like jumbo bags of yeast that have sat unsold. Right. And so it is sort of interesting, right, that there's at least the myth that capitalist production is, or capitalist allocation is allocation is very efficient. It mostly just gets around it by massive over-allocation, right, or overproduction, or...
Right. So, I mean, I would go even further and say that, the issues around toilet paper and yeast, undersupply of toilet paper, oversupply of yeast. I mean, those are interesting and important questions, absolutely. But with respect to the pandemic specific commodities like PPE, ventilators, hospital beds, a range of other items, what was absolutely stunning in this from March onwards was to see the most arch neoliberals from the UK to France to even Donald Trump just suddenly nationalizing things left, right, and center just to make sure that because they could not wait until the market delivered a particular thing. You would have Republican governors complaining to Trump about how suppliers of PPE or masks or gowns or whatever were suddenly halting shipments that they had already paid for because suddenly they were outbid by some larger state, even if that larger state was not at a sort of higher level of confrontation with the disease compared to one of these smaller states. So that is to say that the direction of PPE was based on who was most able to pay, not who had the most need. And so you have these Republican governors basically, I mean, they didn't say, the market isn't working, but they're effectively saying the market isn't working. State, please, will you take over? And Trump, to a greater or lesser extent, did that in many cases. I mean, the Operation Warp Speed, for all of its terrible problems with Trump's meddling with the development of vaccines, nevertheless, that effectively is a form of economic planning. He is saying that, which is similar to efforts in the UK and France and elsewhere, where this is the other thing, talked about antibiotics a few minutes ago, but it's also the case that pharmaceutical companies have largely got out of the business over the last 40 years of producing vaccines. And the reason that they got out of the business of vaccine production and R&D and antibiotic R&D was because they're insufficiently profitable. Once you take them, you have one course of them, then maybe two courses, and then you're done. You're not paying for anything anymore. Whereas drugs for chronic diseases, for which a patient has to take sometimes every day for the rest of their lives, those are much, much more profitable. So they simply got out of the business of doing this. So it was really, really, it was very interesting to see what we had written about in our book, to see that as just emerge amid the pandemic. At the same time, one of the arguments that we make in the book is that nationalization isn't enough. That prior to neoliberalism, there was all sorts of elites were quite comfortable with state planning in their own class interests. And to this day, amidst all this newfound non-neoliberal interest in state planning, once again, there are it is state planning, not necessarily in the interest of people. So, for example, this sort of vaccine nationalism, the state taking over production against people in other states. That's definitely economic planning, but it's planning not in the interest of the mass of the working class.
It was really interesting. I think as I was reading the book, and as you were just talking now, I was thinking a little bit about, there's a tendency for, I think, modern American socialists, particularly, to be attracted to certain kinds of utopian strains of thought that are very horizontalist or sort of anarchist in their flavor. Yeah. And yet I always kind of think in the back of my mind, like, what is the starkest sort of example of where markets are really not working and where really centralization is required? And I do think antibiotics is a really good example in terms of we need them. We need new antibiotics. They are not produced because if they are produced to novel discoveries, very expensive, they get put straight on the shelf, okay? Because to keep them in reserve, because until the other ones don't work anymore. We could solve this, without even any complex sort of central planning, right? I mean, this is literally just would be a democratic decision where we say we are choosing to just vote some amount of society's resources to this problem. Hey, problem solved. And that seems fundamentally incompatible with a kind of a sort of horizontalist or like, we're going to do micro production in our local communities and wear hemp pants or whatever.
Oh, yes. My God. When never mind issues around making sure that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, that the hospital, that, the dialysis machines at the hospital are still working. What are those dialysis machines made out of? They're made out of petrochemicals and steel out of the ground and all of this stuff, requiring vast globe-spanning supply chains. Never mind the question around extraction. Even if you accept that there's a need for extraction, now to talk about local production, there's no way that a computer could be entirely produced locally. It's just absurd. Yeah. The whole point of this is that we should be democratizing these supply chains, unionizing the workers in those supply chains. We need to take over the machine, not turn it off. The outcome from such a small is beautiful localist Eden would be immediate sort of mass death on a scale that, I was going to, the Nazis would be envious of. But that's, I always hate bringing in Nazis because that's just too cheap and easy.
Certainly, it would make all those 90s comets hitting the Earth movies look positively rosy, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about like the vaccine stuff, because we are in a COVID pandemic and that's becoming something that seems to be coming closer. Who knows? And clearly the right and the wine moms of like Orange County are big into anti-vaxxers. But I've noticed a recent trend of like more and more leftists becoming skeptical of taking the vaccine because of its relations to groups like Pfizer or taking World Health Organization
Bill
advice
Gates,
because
they're
of
turning the frogs gay.
because of Bill Gates. How do you reconcile like these are corporate run vaccine trials, which if I clearly these corporations have done major crimes in other parts of the world. How do you reconcile like let's take a vaccine, but also like we can still be skeptical of the broader like corporate structure of these pharmaceutical companies?
Right. Well, first of all, I would say that I would just quote one of my heroes, Ben Goldacre, who's both a clinician and a science communicator, and he's done an enormous amount of work both campaigning against the sheer venality of pharmaceutical corporations and how they're meddling with the science by hiding the results from trials and so on and so very similar sort of practices, ghost writing articles on behalf of doctors that they're put into journals about their own drugs, just really vile sort of activities. He also has no time for alternative medicine, other ways of knowing nonsense. And his famous line, which I adore, is just because big pharma is shit doesn't mean that magic beans cure cancer. And I think what we should be doing is hopefully, depending on science communicators, science journalists like myself, where we can look at something like the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, we familiarized ourselves with it. We can say this is one of the crucial roles of journalists within society. Say, look, we have no skin in this game, and we are telling you we trust this. And a lot of us at the same time will be the same people who will be pointing out that the problems with how the CEO of Pfizer, sold 60% of his shareholding in the company on the very day that these results were released. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can simultaneously defend vaccination as one of the greatest developments in all of human history, most humanitarian endeavors ever undertaken. And in fact, precisely because of that, we are able to and should hold the feet to the fire of the big pharma.
Another really big contributing cause, I think, is the recent Silicon Valley censorship of people being critical of these things. I mean, there was early on, like the Plandemic documentary, which is very problematic. I mean, I watched it just because people were censoring it everywhere. I don't know if any of it's true or not, 'cause I'm not a scientist, but how do we because you're a very big free speech advocate as well, I've noticed on Twitter. How do we comprehend fighting disinformation, but also not fall into the trap of censoring anything, primarily through corporate and bourgeois government policy?
I mean, this is a really great question. It's really, really hard to do this, to thread the needle here. Here I'm full of all sorts of cliches, thread the needle, walk and chew gum. And I think the first thing that we have to do is the title of my article, my essay on this for Jacobin from a couple of weeks ago was tough on anti-vax nonsense, tough on the causes of anti-vax nonsense. So at the same time that we are going hard after the charlatans and quacks and peddlers of disinformation, the anti-vax campaigners, we should also understand and have deep empathy for why it is so many people have lost trust in experts over the last 20, 30, 40 years. I'm not surprised that after the 2008 economic crisis, when all of our leaders who said, trust the experts, trust the economists, everything's going to be fine, lost so much of their wealth, lost their houses, lost their jobs. That's our starting point, is a deep humanist empathy for why people might not trust experts. That doesn't mean we excuse it, But we have to have empathy for that. And that informs the way that we have a conversation with them. Instead of being sort of like Richard Dawkins, new atheist style, sneering teacher to these people, we have a level of empathy in saying, look, like, I get you. I don't trust Big Pharma either. And then you, hopefully, because they're now trusting you because you said you don't trust them either, they're more open to what you're having to say. I think another group that's really sort of like a hero of mine is the Treatment Action Group in South Africa during the 1990s, which was an AIDS campaign group at a time when cocktails of drugs were being finally delivered to North Americans and Europeans, so long as you had healthcare, but generic versions of these drugs were not being delivered to Black South Africans, poor South Africans. And Big Pharma was actively campaigning to prevent access to cheap generic access to these drugs. So that was one battlefront. The second battlefront was that the ANC, the leader of the African National Congress at the time, President Thabo Mbeki, was an utter neoliberal. And he simply didn't want to spend the money on healthcare for his people. So that was another battlefront. And then the third battle, and he was also an AIDS denialist, denying that HIV actually caused AIDS, and which was handy because it meant that he didn't have to spend the money on the drugs or other forms of treatment. And finally, in a lot of communities where there were low levels of education, sometimes there were sort of shaman, basically, witch doctors. I don't want to use sort of derogatory language, but at the same time, that's sort of what they were. And they were basically saying to people that, use traditional medicine, use garlic and carrots and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and these ceremonies, and it will rid you of the disease. So there was three different battlefronts that the Treatment Action Group campaigned on there: against domestic neoliberalism, against international racism and corporate villainy, and at the same time empathetic but hard arguments against alternative medicine nonsense in their own communities. That is a model for the world. That's the sort of, I would actually say, like, and the level of scientific literacy, the self-training of these activists, the deep humanist commitment that they had. Some of their leaders just who were wealthier, refused to take drugs once they became available until everybody had access to them. I mean, these are, my eyes begin to leak when I think about these people. That is the model for the left. That's what I would love the left to be internationally.
Well, I feel like we could go on and on, just asking about every question we've had unanswered, every unresolved scientific debate. Unfortunately, if we're not allowed to just title the video like, Leigh Phillips destroys anti-vaxxers, we'll have to call it. But Leigh, where do people find more of you? What are you working on next? Anything you want to, tip us in on?
I've got a couple of articles coming out in the next few weeks that I'm really late with delivering to Bhaskar Sankar, the editor at Jacobin. And if he's listening to this when it comes out, I'm really sorry they're not done yet.
If he's listening to this, we're really sorry for all the times we've been mean to him on the pod. So I don't think he listens.
Okay. I'm really late with getting the introduction to my next book to my agent, and that is that's going to be about comparative cognition, looking at not just that, but comparative levels of cognition amongst different animals and other organisms, and sort of paleo ecology and mass extinction events, and basically it's about humanity's place within nature, to mount basically a scientifically grounded socialist defense of human supremacy.
Oh, wow, that's controversial. How do we? I can't. Now I'm excited to hear that. And then we will make sure your Twitter's linked in the bio, and we'll drop a couple of your recent articles, and certainly links to where people can buy the books. Because, as I say, if you read only 2 books this year, make sure it's 2 with Leigh Phillips on the cover. Leigh Phillips, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been great. Thanks, guys.